Americans are saying, are you not paying attention to what is actually happening? Millions of people are being brought into this country, and we know that the left doesn't actually care about these people. The left does not understand a red state America, evangelical Christianity.
Evangelical leadership has been writing from the progressive gaze, so that whenever they're writing anything, or they're doing this commentary, or they're analyzing how Christians should approach different social issues, they're doing it with this little progressive on their shoulder. I see the damage that turning the church into a social club will do to these people who really need the words of life. And they're not going to get that if they're walking into the church doors and hearing about how they need to become climate change activists.
We believe that as Christians, we should engage in the political realm, but that it is our Christian belief that informs our political views. What would you say to someone who's listening?
So,
welcome to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton, and I am pleased to have with me today author, provocateur, Molotov cocktail tossing Megan Basham, the author of this book, recently released, Shepherds for Sale. It is an excellent book that is creating something of a stir. Megan, how are you?
I'm good. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me, particularly with one of my interviewees for this book. So I think you might be the first person I guess Eric Metaxas too. So both of you I interviewed and included in the book, and it's nice to do interviews with the people who helped make it happen.
Well, it's interesting. I just did an interview with Eric yesterday, and we were talking about Phil Vischer, and that led us to discussing you briefly in that interview. I know that he has appreciated what you've had to say in this book, as have I, as have many others. But here we are faced with, we're approaching rapidly a presidential election where you have some. Of course, the left is always the left. Democrats are going to Democrat, but we also have insidious elements within the church, and that really is what your book is about. Give us the thumbnail of this book.
So the thumbnail is really that Shepherds for Sale is both a literal and a metaphorical title. So you have the shepherds who are for sale in terms of being literally partnered up with financial left-wing power brokers who are funneling money into evangelical institutions to create front groups, to move evangelicals to the left on particular political priorities. And then you also have some who I would say are metaphorically for sale, in the sense that they're selling out their influence for the acclaim of the secular media, for secular cultural approval. And so you see them really shifting their rhetoric and doing what we call the punch right, coddle left phenomenon, because they want to maintain that respectability among the dominant culture. So really two kinds, of selling out, and that's what the book is about. And it's been funny as it's come out, is I've had a lot of people who have suddenly, I think disingenuously, pretended that they do not know that a title can have multiple meanings.
Well, I have seen some of the criticism of your book online. None of it, substantive. And this is going to flop right off the end of my table here, but at least people can. It looks like I'm, kind of creating a little bit of a wall, like I did in high school, so that my teachers couldn't see that I wasn't actually doing the work. Who are some of the chief villains in this story?
Well, I hesitate to use the word villain, but...
No, but I used the word villain. I used it. You didn't use it. I used it.
I think I could say bad actors, though, and people who are compromising and bringing this kind of thing in the church. So if you look at Russell Moore, I would say he is probably the key figure who has been promoting so much of this really cheap sloganeering, and then pretending that Christians have to buy into these policies in order to be obedient to Christ. So things like, you must welcome the stranger, which means that you have to endorse open borders policies to be a Christian. Or you have others like J.D. Greear, who heavily promoted things like DEI policies, racial quotas, CRT. And, he's heavily influential. You have Tim Keller, who brought in this notion that there's something power grasping and particularly discrediting about being a Christian Trump voter. So I talk about a lot of these figures, Andy Stanley bringing in LGBTQ accommodation. And I think that's part of why it became so explosive is I didn't just talk about this in general terms. I really documented journalistically, here's who's doing it, here's what they've done, here's the receipts, and here's the paper trail.
It's interesting you mentioned Russell Moore. I don't know if I told you this when you were in the process of writing this book and doing, your interviews, and we talked on a few occasions. Always seemed like I was in the car going somewhere or sitting in an airport lounge waiting for a flight. But in I think it was 2007, possibly 2006. I was invited to a mega church to do an apologetics conference. Tell me if I've told you this story.
I don't think so.
And there were only two of us speaking. It was myself and Russell Moore, who I did not know at the time. He was dean of the doctoral program at Southern Seminary at that time. And I wanted to be polite. I think he spoke on, say, Thursday night, and then I spoke Friday night. And each of our talks were followed by a Q&A with this enormous church and sitting down with the pastor and just having a conversation. So on his night, I think he spoke first. On Thursday night, I went to hear him because I didn't know him. And I was fascinated by the fact that, and all the more so now, given your own researches, and I've written some about Moore in the last few years, he was, I would say, ultra conservative. Mm-hmm. So much so that on that occasion, he went after, and this is ironic given where he finds himself now, a major thrust of his talk that night was VeggieTales. He was going after VeggieTales as not particularly Christian and as harmful to your children. And then a second thing he went after, being a Southern Baptist, he went after alcohol. And I'm practically a teetotaler, but I thought, that's not a hill I want to die on. Jesus turned water into wine. I mean, we do know this. Was it grape juice that the wedding guests were getting a little buzz on? It was wine, but I thought, okay, I'm not going to say anything about that. But the pastor, to have a little bit of fun with me the next night, knowing that I was PCA, he said, "Hey, what did you think about what he had to say, about alcohol?" And I thought, okay, here we go with this. But again, Russell Moore, I would have described as being ultra conservative. And now look at where he is. Do you think that this is a story of, say, Luke 16, of the shrewd manager who has licked his finger and decided he sees which way the social winds are blowing, and has ingratiated himself to a new master to create another dwelling for himself, a place to go? Or do you think his political views changed?
So I definitely think it's the former. And as you're describing that, I can't think of a better analogy for what seems to me to have happened in Russell Moore's evolution. But what's funny is, as you tell this story, I do see a through line, and that is that legalism, that same legalism that said everyone must accept drinking alcohol as sin when it's something that seems obvious to me as a personal conscience matter. You actually saw that same kind of legalism in his approach to things like how COVID needed to be handled. He was very much at the front lines of saying everyone needs to get this shot in order to show that they love their neighbors. People need to obey the mask mandates in order to show that they love their neighbors. I don't know if you remember, but he was posting those now frequently mocked images of himself double masked in the car. Mm-hmm. And when you say that, it's funny to me to go, I actually see a little bit of a parallel there in how he approaches issues, which is with this just hard line, everybody needs to agree with me or they are somehow falling afoul of Scripture, when these are issues that are certainly matters that Christians of good faith can debate on. When you talk about how he went from the hard right, ultra conservative, to the hard left, well, I won't say hard left, but I will say within evangelicalism, certainly progressive. I think a huge part of that is the shrewd manager thing. And I think the shrewd managers are particularly at the New York Times, at the Atlantic. And I think that's how he ended up at Christianity Today. If you look at his just appearing on MSNBC on Morning Joe this week, we were just in the wake of a second presidential attempted assassination. So someone tried to kill Donald Trump. The very next morning, Russell Moore appears on Morning Joe to talk about divisive and harmful political rhetoric and the importance of toning it down. And he spent the entire time talking about the issues of the Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, and whether or not they eat cats and dogs and are taking geese out of the local parks. And there's been a lot of accounts that they have. And he immediately said, no, it's sinful for anyone to even engage in a discussion about whether or not that's happening, which to me, I think it's
on Twitter, he said demonic.
Demonic. That's right.
It's demonic.
Satanic too. On
Yes.
Twitter, he called it, I guess we have to call it X now, but on Twitter, he called it satanic. So there's this incredibly judgmental commentary coming from him when it's something that's still up for debate. We don't really know what's happening on the ground in Springfield, Ohio. We know that this is what some of the residents of that city are telling us. I think if they're calling the police to make these reports, if they're willing to get up in city council meetings and bring it up, at the very least, we shouldn't dismiss them as spreading satanic rumors, right? It's worth sitting for a moment and going, okay, is there some truth to this? So when you talk about that, I think that's actually a consistent pattern for Russell Moore. And part of that also comes from the circles that he travels in. So when he was somebody who was trying to ingratiate himself at Southern Seminary and trying to come up in the ranks of the Southern Baptist Convention, where conservatism is the currency of the realm, he was trying to be the most conservative guy. And now that you see him coming up in the ranks of secular media, the Aspen Institute, Trinity Forum, you see him being the most hyperbolic in his rhetoric when it comes to Christians who aren't aligning with these progressive policies or even, the progressive positions that you hear people taking on the news of the day. So that's kind of not surprising to me.
Yeah, it's not to me either. Well, it was surprising to me initially because again, in that and on that particular occasion, he was so ultra conservative that I don't know exactly when, but when he appeared on my radar again, and I'm seeing him probably with COVID, when I'm seeing him, take some of the positions he was taking, I was going like, what? This is the guy that that I did this conference with, who made me look like I was somehow, more liberal than he was. And then we find him in this very strange place. As for Springfield, that's kind of what got me into it on Twitter with Vischer. And it's because I find that what these guys do, in fact, I'm thinking about doing an entire episode just on the tactics of the left to try to help people wade through and process what it is that they do and how they do it. So Vischer was essentially, and it's oddly, I'm sure they didn't get the same memo, but you see Russell Moore tweeting about essentially tone. You can't say these things about these people. It's so awful. It's so unchristian. It's so satanic. Vile, I think, was another word that he used. And then Vischer was tweeting something very similar to that. And I thought, isn't it interesting? These guys always want to make it about tone, about mean tweets, these kinds of things. And what really bothered me in the case of Moore, and you could say this about Vischer as well, not that Vischer is a pastor, but we should all have, as Christians, a kind of pastoral concern. Not just Dostoevsky says in The Brothers Karamazov, he says that liberals love man in the general, in the abstract, just not in the particular. They just and that's what I find is the case here, that they don't actually care about their actual neighbors, but it's your neighbor, this vague mass of people who are coming into the United States illegally. You're supposed to care about them. And so I was saying to Vischer, you guys want to make this all about tone, and you keep talking about your neighbor. Phil, what about your actual neighbors? How about American citizens? You want to make this isn't about cats and dogs and ducks disappearing. This is the concern, the outrage of American citizens who recognize that illegals, by Phil's own count, 20 million people, coming into the country who are being weaponized against them to change the social and political fabric of this country. You probably haven't heard about this in mainstream media yet. The U.S. economy and the U.S. dollar are on the brink of collapse on multiple fronts. The U.S. dollar is being pummeled, and it could collapse in the fall of 2024, this year, leading to a depression that we haven't seen before. Although major news outlets and current Federal Reserve policymakers have been upbeat on the economy and say inflation is nearing the Fed's target, Americans' wallets are still being pinched due to the extreme high prices, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to maintain a comfortable standard of living. It's no surprise that the U.S. household debt skyrocketed above $17 trillion. The current economic environment has caused Americans to borrow at a rate we've never seen in our history. The Great American Debt Crisis could spark a major economic downturn far worse than the Great Financial Crisis. The labor market is starting to cool, and major U.S. banks such as Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan say the markets are indicating a higher chance of our country entering a recession. It's no wonder why some Americans are bracing for the worst. Imagine what happens next. Hyperinflation, skyrocketing prices, and a recession that could last for years to come. And all of this could happen after November this year. Your purchasing power could plummet even further, and ultimately this could lead to the collapse of the U.S. dollar, leaving you struggling to afford the bare necessities. We've already seen food prices rise by more than 25% since November of 2020. If the U.S. dollar collapses, that could push more Americans into poverty and lead to social unrest. The worst part, the government won't protect Americans' wallets or bail out Americans. It's on you to safeguard your assets and retirement and secure your future. Given the timely nature of this news, it's of the utmost importance for you to click the link below to get Monetary Gold's complimentary asset protection guide. Inside, you'll discover exactly why the U.S. dollar may collapse from debt by the fall of 2024 and how to prepare for a collapsing economy. You'll also learn about an IRS loophole that you could save thousands of dollars in taxes by using. Do not miss out on the opportunity to safeguard your assets now, because in the coming weeks, it may be too late. Call now at 800-888-2151. That's 800-888-2151. As I was saying to Eric yesterday, I mean, if you came home, Eric, and you're, I don't mean to make it sound like Eric would be in disagreement with me. He certainly wasn't. But I said, if you came home and your daughter was shouting expletives at the neighbor, and you said, hold on, what's going on here? And she says, well, they broke into the house and they stole things and threatened me. Would you then proceed to lecture her on her tone? Well, no, you wouldn't. And that's the way they work. They want to bind the consciences of Christians and say, how dare you speak like that? And Americans are saying, are you not paying attention to what is actually happening? This is fear, justifiable fear, outrage, concern over the fact that millions of people are being brought into this country. And we know that Schumer and Pelosi, they're openly talking about fast-tracking them to citizenship and giving them the vote, and Americans are being given the bills. You're going to pay for this. You're going to pay for their housing. You're going to pay to fly them in all over the country. I saw that when I've been in South America maybe north of 10 times in the last 5 years, where I'm watching the UN and other NGOs loading them on planes and saying, we're even being told not to do much by way of background checks on these people. So when they try to make it about tone, I find that outrageous. Do you find that that's the way they try to manipulate the conversation, is binding consciences and making the conversation about something that it's not about?
Yes, absolutely. And what you see there is a process of plausible deniability. So if you look at Moore and you look at his work with the evangelical immigration table, part of what happened there that became so explosive out of the book was showing the receipts of how they were partnering with these left-wing foundations, National Immigration Forum, that is Soros-backed. And there was a lot of denial. And I think the denial was there because they want to maintain this image of we are purely doing this out of Christian altruism, when in fact there's a whole lot more going on behind the scenes. But part of what they do is they're pushing these policies that are very left-wing. For example, they opposed the Remain in Mexico policy. Moore and the Evangelical Immigration Table lobbied Biden to end that very reasonable policy that required people who were traveling through other nations to first seek asylum in a third country before they get to the United States. It's really hard to argue that there's not something reasonable in that everyone has to get into the United States. But what you see them do is they will put out these statements that are very tone-driven, saying, we believe in law and order. We want to see a nation of laws enforced. And yet, once you get aside from, okay, they put out this general statement that anybody as a Christian would go, yes, I agree with that. I certainly agree that all immigrants, legal or illegal, are made in the image of God. But they then take this general statement to push these really progressive policies. So I think that tone is what gives them their cover. Because if they use this churchy language, they use this Christianese, and they don't get down to brass tacks. Okay, what are we talking about here in terms of policy? And what's the impact of those policies? Because when we ended the Remain in Mexico policy, we had a flood of illegal immigrants, many of them young men who are gang members, who are committing crimes. And this tone policing insists that if you bring that up, if you bring up the activities and the particular qualities of the people who are crossing illegally, at that point, it's racist. So if you're going to call it racist, then what you've done now is make it so we can't have an honest discussion about what's happening. And I mean, I agree with you that it's not about the dogs and the cats and the pets. It's not. And yet I think that became so emblematic because it was an issue where people saw a culture clash, where if this is going on, it's clearly a very different culture from what Americans know. And it means we're introducing practices and customs into our neighborhoods and our communities that are extremely foreign and distasteful to us. And acknowledging that openly, if that's going on, that was something that there was a real quick desire to try to cut that off because it represented something so much bigger. So it's not just, okay, do I have a neighbor from Haiti who would actually, cook a domesticated animal? I don't know that. But I do know that you also had, along with those stories, people in Springfield saying, these are people who are coming into our grocery stores and they're just eating out of the glass cases, of the refrigerated cases. They're throwing garbage. They're doing these things that to Americans are not part of our culture. They are not part of how we live our lives, and we don't want to change our standards of how we live our lives. And so that's just one part of it. And then you get at the bigger part that they really don't want to touch is, what does this mean to the people in these communities who aren't getting these jobs anymore? So if you have illegal immigrants who are getting, I think I've seen something like in the realm of $30,000 plus in SNAP benefits, housing benefits, various entitlements and welfare benefits, whereas the median income in Springfield is $22,000. And these are specifics that they don't want to talk about. And that tone policing is a way to hedge off that conversation by saying, well, it's mean, because why are you trying to deny these people help? And they're not acknowledging, okay, because we have a government whose first responsibility is to its citizens. And so we're going to muddy the waters with the general, neighbor, love your neighbor, and the general mankind that you just brought up. But it reminds me a little bit, and you'll probably know because I don't. I always forget which book it was, but there was a Dickens book, and you'll tell me if you remember, Larry, where there was a character who was a mother who was entirely neglectful of her own children because she was so invested in missionary work, and she was constantly promoting the great work she did to serve the missionaries while her own children were running around.
I think that's Great Expectations.
Is that it? Anyway, it was...
I think that's Great Expectations. I hated Great Expectations when I was, had to read that, whatever that is, 8th grade or something like that. And I'm drawing on a reserves there, so I might be mistaken, but I think that's great expectations. But yeah, you're right, and I want to underscore something you just said there. The United States government's primary responsibility is to its citizens. And yes, we can have a very interesting theological discussion about who our neighbors are. But your responsibility begins with those people you actually interact with, not just the, not just the unknown, masses, but the actual people you are interacting with. And we know that the left doesn't actually care about these people. We saw what happened at Martha's Vineyard, how they very rapidly, brought in the National Guard to get them all and load them on buses and ship them out. The American people, and they're known this way around the world, are a very tolerant and generous people. Statistically, the most generous people in the world. And I find it, dare I say, demonic, vile, when guys like Moore and French and Vischer and others want to bind the conscience of the American people, want to guilt them into saying that they're doing something really awful and terrible because they want to defend their own communities and they want to defend their own borders.
No, I agree. And I think that we can't separate what you opened this interview with, which was the fact that Russell Moore has become like that shrewd steward who is being invited to the Aspen Institute. And there's nothing wrong with going to the Aspen Institute if you're going to speak truth and you're going to, present the basic biblical ideals of how we engage with these issues. But that's not what he's doing. He goes to these events and disparages his fellow Christians because they don't get on board with these policies. And to me, so much of this is a way to avoid being specific about his own activity. So when he uses terminology like satanic, like vile, what that's supposed to do is keep you from asking, okay, well, why are you involved with the evangelical immigration
Yes.
table? Why does George Soros name you as a grantee in his own documents? And it becomes where it's fringy to even ask that question. So you step forward and you go, no, we have real documentation of these things. And there's just this immediate sense that they put out with general hyperbole that's, well, it's just icky. And it seems kind of conspiracy theory for you to even ask, even though it's right there in black and white. And so if you have the temerity to ask, then they'll go, oh, well, you're not a serious person. So that's the kind of thing that you face again and again. And I think when you look at Moore and his very close friend and traveling companion, David French, that's part of the reason that they don't ever give specifics. I mean, I can tell you, I read through so many of David French's columns in the New York Times. I read through so many of Russell Moore's accusations against conservatives in the Southern Baptist Convention, in other Christian institutions. And what he will do is always use this hyperbole of, well, there are neo-Confederates sitting in our pews. There are closet racists sitting in our pews, but he doesn't ever offer specifics on what are you talking about? Who are they? What marked them out as neo-Confederates and racists? Was it just opposing these immigration policies? Is it things like debating what's happening in Springfield? He doesn't offer specifics, and I think that's because on a journalistic level, then you can't go and cross-check it. So I don't know if it's true. And then those stories then get amplified in the Washington Post, the New York Times. This is kind of on a separate subject, but I can give you the example of how he and others handled this what I would call a very manufactured abuse crisis within the Southern Baptist Convention and evangelicalism more broadly, where they claimed there was a massive issue of sexual abuse. And when you actually went and dug into the cases they were pointing at, there was almost nothing there. But the media never comes back and says, okay, you said that women and children are getting torn apart in these churches. So that's that Russell Moore purple prose again. And when you drill down and try to go, okay, well, what do you mean by that? What's happening? And you investigate the actual cases where they brought this sort of thing up, you find an adult woman and an adult man in a very murky situation where it's hard to figure out what happened. And yet the media that serves as his backer in so much of this never goes back and asks those questions.
As we go through life, the years bring us wisdom, experience, and memories we hold dear. Yet with age, our health often faces new challenges. It's a natural part of life, but it's crucial to address these changes with the right care and attention. For me, one of the ways to stay sharp is to supplement. I've been using Liver Health Formula, and I recommend you try it for yourself to see the results that it can bring. And right now, I think is the time to start taking care of your liver, because there is a silent epidemic affecting 100 million Americans. 1 in 3 Americans suffer from an overworked and sluggish liver. It affects our weight, energy levels, clear thinking and productivity, and even sleep. Our livers get bombed every day with GMOs, microplastics, toxins, and all of the stuff that you might not even know about. Liver Health Formula can support your liver to minimize the impacts of all of this. It is a premium supplement designed with 11 clinically proven botanicals to support and detoxify your liver, helping you feel revitalized and ready to conquer each day. Just listen to Mr. Harrington's testimonial, who shared his transformative journey. At first, I was skeptical, but the health improvement has been nothing but amazing. The tired, foggy feeling I've had is gone. I have more energy for a longer duration. Also, the service and delivery is always prompt. Of course, results are not typical, thus you have to see for yourself. There's an exclusive deal for my audience. Head to getliverhelp.com/Larry. And as a special offer, you'll get a free 1-month supply of nano-powered omega-3s with your order. That's getliverhelp.com/Larry. Yeah, and it's, of course, because they fit a convenient narrative. And one of the things that they do, more in particular, French as well, it's as though sin nature has only polluted white people, and particularly white American males. Most of all, they provide theological backing to, believe all women, or to the immigration agenda, to all of that. Something you just said there, no problem being a part of the Aspen Institute or going to the World Economic Forum or whatever it is. I began my career, I'm very tuned into this where Moore and French are concerned, because I've been there. I began my career as kind of an acceptable, urbane writer and commentator as the token conservative on the left. So part of my personal mission, 2 Corinthians 10:5, we demolish arguments and every lofty opinion that is set up against the knowledge of God, and I construct arguments. And I thought, what I really want to do in my own personal work is I want to penetrate the corridors of power and go as far to the left as I possibly can with my writing and speaking. So I look for opportunities to speak to atheistic groups, to speak on, leftist college campuses. I wrote for The Atlantic. I was doing commentary for, CNN, all those kinds of things. And I've taken, even now, somebody will read my byline and say, I'm not going to listen to anything you have to say. You work for CNN. Well, I was never an employee, but I endeavored, because those are the people I want to be in front of. You know what I'm talking about. I don't just want to throw red meat, to the crowd. But around 2016, that started changing with the election of Trump, and it became harder and harder and harder to get published or get invitations on that side anymore, because the producers and the editors, who were always liberal, but they were old school liberals who believed in a marketplace of ideas. So I get a call, this is during the pandemic, I get a call from a producer at NPR's All Things Considered and says, would you consider being our conservative on that show? And I said, I would relish it. I would love that opportunity. But if you think that your higher ups are going to have me, you're naive. There's no chance. And he said, I think we can arrange it. We'd love to have you. I never heard another word about it. And I knew that wasn't going to happen, because they prefer platforming someone else. So where I'm going with this is, you always had to ask yourself, when CNN is having you on, and I actually enjoyed the work that I did for CNN, or The Atlantic is platforming me, what's their angle here? Mm-hmm. What is it that they're getting, out of this? And now, when I can no longer go into those places, at least with integrity, I I see more in French and all these guys over there, and I know what's happening. They've had to sell their souls to go into those places. I don't know if I'm articulating this particularly well,
No,
but you understand
you
what I'm
are.
getting
I
at?
do. And it's funny. I think just within the last few days, something you said is so interesting, that this assumption that if it's something white evangelicals do, then it's somehow wrong. Because I think I saw just a few days ago, Russell Moore, David French, citing the fact that, okay, once again, white evangelicals, polling is showing, are backing Trump. And again, at about the same rate that they backed Romney, McCain, Bush, because they tend to be conservative and they tend to go in that direction. But it was cited on its face, no other information, just the fact that white evangelicals are backing Trump. They're like, look at this discrediting data that we're getting coming from polling organizations, which, why should that be discrediting? Why should the fact that roughly 80% of white evangelicals are currently backing Trump with no other information, why do they assume that that is discrediting? It is like saying, if white evangelicals are doing it, by virtue of the fact that they're white evangelicals, it's problematic.
It's got to be wrong, terrible. It's got to be terrible. Do you think, Megan, that these people have actual audiences? Do we exaggerate? I've wondered this many times, because it feels to me like David French's main audience is us, in the sense that we don't like him and we discuss the things that he says. But they're laughing behind I know exactly what they're doing at the New York Times. They are laughing behind their hands that this is Vidkin Quisling. They are using him against, that he is a cudgel that they use against evangelicals. Liberals aren't reading him and taking him particularly seriously. Same with Russell Moore. So do you think that in their current iterations, speaking the way they do now, not trying to ingratiate themselves back to conservatives, but do you think that they would survive in an open market where they didn't have leftist backing? Do you think they have actual big liberal Christian followings?
No, first of all, I don't think there is a big liberal Christian following.
I don't either.
I think that
I don't think there's such a thing.
Right. I mean, I think that patronage is everything, because when you look at who's sharing David French, I mean, there's sort of a squishy progressive Christianity now, but I think it is in fact the fringe group. And to get a little controversial myself, I will say that I think my former editor, Marvin Olasky, is one of those who moved in that direction. And so I think there's this little sort of quirky group of guys like that who are sharing this stuff, and they share it amongst each other. And it then gets amplified to non-Christians. So I think non-Christians are ultimately the audience for this stuff, because then they share it around and go, look, even these other Christians say how horrible these guys are. Therefore, it's okay for us to hate and disparage them, because we have the word of these court evangelicals telling us that these are terrible people. So, I mean, I think that's the purpose they serve. What's going to be interesting to me to see is, as time goes on and it becomes more clear to these secular left patrons that all of the rank and file evangelicals have these guys' numbers, they know who they are, they're not influenced by them at all, do they become like Sojourners, or like someone like Richard Cizik, who at one time was sort of considered a mainstream evangelical, your Jim Wallace, but eventually they kind of fell out of favor with the secular left media, because there was a recognition that, oh, they actually have no influence, so they're not helping us at all in our cause. So we have to get somebody else who was at one time a recognized conservative evangelical, and they now have to become the voice speaking out against their brethren. Because when was the last time you really saw anyone of any note citing Jim Wallace or Sojourners? I mean, occasionally you see them pop up, but I think everybody recognizes, they sort of have Christian trappings, but they're just a left-wing progressive group now. They're not really respected by anybody in the broad swath of evangelicalism. So at that point, I think they're not useful to them anymore. And what happens to them? I don't know.
Exactly. And I think it tells us a little bit about how the left does not understand a red state America, evangelical Christianity, real America. Years ago, a producer who worked for Paula Zahn, okay, texted me, and she said, we're about to have on T.D. Jakes. This is maybe 20 years ago. And she said, Paula doesn't know what to ask him. And of course, this raised obvious questions for me. Why then are you having him on the show? And she said, can you give us some questions to ask? And so I fired off some questions that were, theological. I think I'm right in saying this. He questioned the Trinity, and, you might bring that up, and his megachurch and stuff like this. I said, he's an articulate guy. He's a friendly guy. I don't think you'll find this difficult. So I fire off these questions. And then the text comes back and says, Paula says that she could ask these questions, but she wouldn't know what to say after he answered them. She couldn't follow them up. So in other words, she couldn't have a conversation with him of any kind of theological nature about Christianity at all, none of that. So I turn on the TV to see what they ultimately do, and she says, so what's your opinion of the war in Iraq? And I thought, so you're having a pastor on to discuss this, and it was such an insight for me. They don't understand America outside of the Beltway, outside of their bubble. So when they're looking for guys that they think will have influence for their cause, they choose people just the way you said it. I like the way you put it, who really are not representative of evangelical Christianity anyway. And that brings me to Tim Keller, because that's what makes Keller's influence so insidious when he began embracing a kind of soft Marxism. When I was coming along, I was a reader of Keller's books, but I'm theologically speaking, I'm Reformed, and a longtime member of the PCA, or a Reformed Baptist Church, in one form or another. And Keller was a guy that was constantly being quoted and being held up as kind of our unofficial pope. Now, I wasn't reading Keller, but I'm hearing him quoted from the pulpit by pastors that I respect, and I'm going, okay, well, this Keller guy, he must be the man, because they are all quoting him. And then I get a call, and this kind of goes to our conversation prior to you coming on the show. As I say, I think of my work as I'm standing on the wall of the church and I'm looking outward for threats on the horizon. I rarely turn inward. But another pastor friend of mine, a PCA, one of the most theologically astute guys that I know, said, Larry, we need you to turn your turret towards Keller. And I was like, what, Keller? The guy you all love and you're quoting constantly, and who is apparently this big theological powerhouse and intellectual? He said, Larry, just read his book on tithing, and he says, it's socialist. He says, it's very strange. It is a weird book. And he said, I'm just saying, I think you need to start paying attention to what he's saying. So I did. I started paying closer attention to Keller. I began listening to it. I'd already listened to a sermon series that he'd done on John that I thought was superb. Mm-hmm. And then I'm listening to this, and I'm reading his articles, say in the New York Times or somewhere else, and I'm going, okay, well, we are in the era where now if the New York Times is platforming Megan Basham, I need to raise an eyebrow and go, why? Why are they doing that? Because they don't do the way they do it the way they used to do it. And sure enough, it's because he was pushing a kind of soft Marxism, socialism. So I ended up addressing that issue. But unfortunately, because Keller, by this time, you had a generation of young pastors coming along who all had their own pastors and seminary professors tell them that he was the end all, who are now starting to reverse course and saying, wait, maybe not. But it was too late, because this was a guy who was in the church, who was highly respected in a way that David French, never has been. And hence the reason that his influence was so insidious. Do you agree with my take on that?
I do. And, Larry, I don't do the ideology as much just because I'm not equipped to do it. I don't know Marxism well. I know the broad, overview of these issues, but I know the details in terms of what Keller has spoken about to the press, because that's my world, how he's interacted with the media.
Well, and pardon me for 1 second,
Yeah.
Megan, but you can also see what isn't true.
Correct.
You're very good at saying, well, what you just said does not align with the text.
Exactly. And that was where I was going, in the sense that when I saw these things, yes, little socialism alarm bells went off, because I had liked Keller also in the past, and I still have benefited from a lot of things that Keller wrote and spoke on, particularly when he intersected with the arts. I really liked his arts and culture commentary. But when I saw the direction Keller was going, because I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't want to write about Keller in this book. He had died not that long ago. He was so revered. I knew that if I addressed Keller, it was going to be a huge can of worms, not just because Keller has been so held out as the evangelical intellectual, and he has been that. I mean, he has been presented as, look, we have somebody who's a really smart guy and who's really a deep thinker. He is our intellectual too. And I think so many people just kind of pointed to Keller as being the refutation of the scandal of the evangelical mind. We have an evangelical mind, and here he is. So you saw that so much. But then when you looked at how he intersected with basic current events and politics, it was concerning to me. And so when I wrote about him, I knew that I was opening a can of worms. I knew that there would be backlash, in part because so many institutions are now built around Keller. If you look at the Gospel Coalition, if you look at its fellowship program, so many of these future institutions and the directions that they're headed were set by Tim Keller. Whether he did that intentionally or not, that's just how it's evolved. So when Keller stands back and says something like, we have a problem with conservative evangelicals who are backing someone like Donald Trump, grasping for power, and my kingdom is not of this world, is what Christ tells us. So therefore, Christians need to relinquish power. We have a problem, because what that means is all over evangelicalism, you have these young pastors and these young institutional leaders carrying out this message that there's something, and yes, I did write this, uniquely discrediting to Keller about people who are backing Trump, who are getting involved in politics or taking up debates in the public sphere. Ironically, even though he was also doing that, his commentary was, these other people who are doing it are grasping for power, and that's not the way of Jesus. So he was setting an entire agenda that you saw this young generation of pastors, very soft-spoken, very gentle tone pastors following, and it's shaping evangelicalism in a way that it is requiring us to completely forfeit our cultural influence, to forfeit our mandate to be salt and light. And so that was a problem. And so I wrote about it specifically, and I cited essays that Keller wrote. When you talk about who's being welcomed by some of these outlets, Keller was being welcomed by the New Yorker to write essays like, can evangelicalism survive Donald Trump? He was giving interviews to UK outlets where he was saying, Donald Trump makes it harder to witness. He's damaging our Christian witness. He was going to these confabs of other evangelical leaders right in the wake of 2016 to discuss what they were going to do about the perception problem now that all of these Christians had voted for Donald Trump. So Keller was the banner carrier of saying, these Christians are a problem. These Christians who are backing Donald Trump, these Christians who believe that we need to have influence in the political sphere, they are a real problem. And so there was no avoiding Keller in that sense. So I had to write about him. I had to write about the things he was talking about. And I expected the blowback. What I didn't expect was so much of how so many people were trying to deny his black and white words. I mean, he said these things, he wrote these things. And so you had people trying to rewrite history going, well, that's not what he meant. And I'm like, I don't know what else you can mean by how will evangelicalism survive Donald Trump? Obviously, he thought it was discrediting.
Yeah, it was very strange because he was a guy exactly as you described him. And as I say, I listened to a sermon series that he did probably back in, it might have been in the 90s. That was, that is, I didn't listen to it in the 90s, but I think the series was from the 90s on the Gospel of John. And I thought it was very, very good. And as a PCA delegate, I went to the General Assembly and I remember listening to him speak on the ordination of women. And I thought, okay, well, this is a departure from where you've been, or at least where it's been understood that you are. And what you would hear from pastors at this point, before he had started really kind of becoming very public and almost full-blown socialist, is, and it's almost like they had all, imbibed, this same terminology, but they would say, they would always excuse this by saying, well, Keller is in New York. So we kind of have to give him a pass on. He's only saying this because he's in New York, and he has to say that because he's in New York. And I'm thinking, well, but it's not true, and it's not correct. And what is your geography have to do with that? And I think it's what he really believed. And then it became fairly clear that it was what he really believed. How much of this do you think is driven? I mean, all the figures that you're talking about in here, but maybe Keller sits at the top of the heap as it relates to this, because he did have a real audience. Whereas I'm not sure that that French and, say, Russell Moore would have one without the backing of leftist institutions. I'm not sure anybody would be listening to them, but they have propped them up. But Keller did have one. And like you, when I published on Keller in 2020 a piece that got a lot of attention, I got a lot of hostile emails. And I even had friends who are saying, "I can't believe you're criticizing Keller." And I say, look at what he says. I quote him in full. Compare that to the biblical text, which I quote in full. Decide for yourself. I think that what I'm saying here is true. You just don't like that I'm saying this. How much of this do you think is driven by the tendency, I won't say the Christian tendency, maybe the human tendency, to make stars out of such people? And thus they get a sense of their own invulnerability, their own infallibility.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that before, but I do think that that's a significant issue, in that so many people had for so long revered Keller that you get bolder, right, on pronouncing on things that maybe you shouldn't pronounce on. And I think that's a common failing of man. I think if any of us are held up, and I, to a small degree, I'm starting to feel it myself a little bit, like, hey, do you want to comment on this thing going on in Ukraine and Russia? And I go, I don't actually know that much about this. I should sit down. But I think that impulse to comment on all of it is there. And I do think we saw that with Keller. And that's a particular problem with him because, yes, I do think he has a huge influence still. I think his legacy is impacting so many of these young seminary students that we're seeing, and they're going to be the leaders of tomorrow, and they're the leaders of today. And I don't know if you know Joe Rigney, but he has written, and I think this is Keller, he has written on something he calls the progressive gaze. So, we've heard about the male gaze from feminist writers. So
Go ahead.
Gaze, let me specify.
Not Gays.
Not Gays, the gaze, view. And so it's talking about how people write, the feminists use it as, okay, you have this, imaginary male sitting on your shoulder, so that when you write, you're writing within the milieu of how males see the world. So that's the patriarchal gaze, the male gaze. Well, Rigney has argued that Keller and others, or I'm arguing Keller, I don't know if he said Keller, but he has said this evangelical leadership has been writing from the progressive gaze, so that whenever they're writing anything, or they're doing this commentary, or they're analyzing how Christians should approach different social issues, they're doing it with this little progressive on their shoulder who's asking them, well, is this the respectable position? And are you appealing to this platonic progressive who's sitting on your shoulder? And that's how I see Keller. I think he wrote everything through that progressive gaze. And yes, he was in New York, but to me, that actually would have been all the more reason for him to have been challenging to the people who were sitting in his pews. I did a little research when I was writing the book, and some people got upset about this, but I said, I looked at the organizations that Keller founded and the people who were attending his church. There was a lot of Democrat donations there. I traced some of those, none to Republicans, none at all. He had some Democrat politicians sitting in his pews. So to me, that is all the more reason for a faithful pastor to confront those people who are directly under his authority for their political excesses. And that's not what we saw Keller doing. Instead, he was always writing for that ideal progressive audience and what would be appealing to them. And one of the ways we saw that play out, I think, in a sad way that I detail a little bit in the book, was Kirsten Powers from CNN talked about how she went to Keller's church. After he died, she wrote this, I don't know if you call it a memorial because it was largely critical, but she wrote this piece about what Tim Keller had been in her life. And she said that she sat in his church for years, and only slowly over time did she come to realize that Keller and Redeemer Presbyterian believed in the sanctity of human life. They did actually believe that abortion is murder. Over time, she very slowly, but not while sitting in church, came to realize that, they do believe that homosexuality is a sin, that marriage is only between one man and one woman. But she said she never heard it from the pulpit. And eventually, that disconnect between what Redeemer Presbyterian and Tim Keller were asking her to believe and what her progressive presuppositions were could not be reconciled. And she left the church bitter, and she clearly has some pretty bitter feelings about Keller now because they weren't clear about that up front. And, this is kind of a long-winded answer to get to that, but I do think that that's part of the problem that we don't talk about, is that there's a bit of a bait and switch here because we're not telling people up front, here are the costs that you're going to have to count. You may have to take up beliefs and ideas and positions that are biblical, that are completely anathema to our culture. And that's going to be hard for you, and you may have to sacrifice your progressive respectability on the altar of following Christ. And are you going to do it? And I think we would do people a service by letting them know up front that could be required of you. And that, to me, is not happening if we're approaching these things in this Kellerite way of trying to be winsome and slowly bring them in. And maybe over time, they will start to realize that these are the biblical standards.
Yeah, and listen, I understand. I think you understand. Obviously, in writing anything, your book or an article, speaking to an audience, you must be clear on who the target audience is. You have to have that in your head. When I'm going to speak somewhere, I always like to get there a little early if I've not spoken there before, just to wander around with a coffee and donut and try to get a feel. Who are these people? What will resonate with them? I'll never forget, Megan. Many years ago, I was speaking at a junior college, and I made a reference to C.S. Lewis and to Francis Schaeffer, and a young man on their baseball team raised his hand, and he said, "Who are these people?" And I realized I had misjudged my audience. I was speaking. I thought I have to change what I'm talking about entirely here. So I get that. And I can appreciate, as I think you can too, Keller trying to appeal to people of a very different worldview than his own. The danger there is that you end up compromising your own principles. And I also think, and you kind of touched on this at the beginning of your response just now, and there's a term for this. A friend of mine has given it to me recently, and it's gone straight out of my head, but it is where you have such success in one area that you begin feeling yourself competent to pronounce in others. And I've tried very hard to stay in my own lane. I was recently invited by Tim Pool to come on Timcast, and I was like, yeah, sure, love to do that. What are we discussing? And the question, no kidding, was, are we living in a simulation? And I talked them out of the invitation. Sean Davis at the Federalist said, no, you absolutely need to do this. I was like, Sean, after I say no, I have nothing else to contribute to this. And so it's important. I appreciate you saying, that being asked to comment on, Ukraine or something, that you're clear enough on what your expertise, where it falls, and staying there. These guys, Richard Dawkins, I teased him mercilessly about this, but he'd had such phenomenal success with the extended phenotype in 1976, which made him very, very famous as a scientist. He then decided, you know what? I'm a theologian. And he published The God Delusion. Now, he would say, Larry, I sold millions of those books. I would say, but they were garbage. I mean, the content of the book is garbage, but he was sure that he understood those issues and was ready to pronounce on them. And Keller started doing this. He started talking all across the board on this. I've seen this with French. I've seen it with Russell Moore. What kind of pushback did you get with this book. We've talked a little bit about this, but you were having some problems with this book. I mean, not everybody was eager to publish it. I don't mean post-publication. I mean pre-publication.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you I got, which hopefully I don't spark any new ones here, but we got cease and desist letters from the Evangelical Immigration Table and the National Immigration Forum, and went several rounds with them, and had some trusty lawyers who pointed out, look, here's the record, and this is a First Amendment issue, and she as a journalist has every right to publish this information in the public interest about your activities. So that was big. A few things I can't talk about because of the legal ramifications, but I can tell you there were backdoor calls. I ended up
Any threats?
Just legal threats. I mean, nothing, nothing,
no physical
by
threats.
Person. Yeah. But, they were very gentle in tone. They were the proper tone kind of threats that were calls to my publisher from some large institutions to the Harper Christian imprint, for example, saying, well, we have a lot of, now I'm not with Harper Christian, I'm with the conservative imprint Broadside, but there were calls saying we have associations in common, and given that so many people that we both know publish with HarperCollins, could we have a call and air some of our concerns? And thankfully none of that was taken too seriously, but I did end up switching publishers just because there were some backroom calls and things of that nature, and it was reassuring to be outside of the evangelical pressure network, because that very much went into overdrive to try to prevent the book from coming out.
Have you felt yourself well supported?
Very well supported.
And I'm not just referring to your publisher, but I mean, by Christians in general. Do you feel like you're well supported, or that people have distanced themselves from you?
It depends on who you're asking about. I would say, the ordinary Christian reader, I have felt overwhelming support. I have gotten so many messages, calls, emails from people saying, this dovetails with what I experience. And I think that's what's been so great. And I think that's why it's been so hard to dismiss, because it wasn't just that I documented, here's some things that are happening that were entirely new information to people. They might have not have known a lot of it, but they recognized the experience. They went, oh, this Bible study came into my church that required me as a white person to not speak for the first 6 months. And I was supposed to sit there and do the work of anti-racism and read these critical race theory texts for 6 months. They know that happened. They know that their church instituted policies where there were going to be special Bible studies just for minority members, so that they could lament. They recognize that these things were happening. So when I write about, okay, here's what was going on in the background, I think so many people are saying, oh, okay, so that's what was bringing this into my church. I just saw what was happening way downriver, but now I know what was happening upriver. So there's been huge support there. Now, institutionally, and this is not surprising at all, there's been a huge circling of the wagons. Anybody who is in some way associated with Tim Keller, those have been the people who have been writing critical essays or even encouraging people to dismiss it entirely. I can tell you that Tim Alberta, who is, of course, a good friend of Russell Moore, he's a reporter for The Atlantic. He, and everyone has assumed that this was about me, had said, no one should talk about this person anymore in her book because she is wounded and unwell. And I don't know what he meant by that. But,
wow.
Right. So there was some pretty direct broadsides that I went, I don't know what to do with that, other than my husband likes to bring it up a lot now and teasing me. If we're having a disagreement, he'll go, well, you're wounded and unwell. What do you know? But
well, for what it's worth, I've never heard of him. And I've never seen the article.
Oh, good. That's encouraging.
No,
but
meaningless.
Yeah, so in terms of those people, I haven't been surprised that there's been that wagon circling. And there has been some distancing. There are friends that I have who they're not cross-signaling, but they're saying nothing. And I know that they know it's true. I know that they know the reporting is true, but these are institutional guys who are going, they're just hanging back. And I know that they could confirm some of the details and choose not to. So, and that's their prerogative.
Well, the attempt is to make you look like a troublemaker, a muckraker. and that everybody was happy before Megan Basham came along. And it's the same tactic with Donald Trump. It's a microcosm of the same thing. The problems were all there. It's just that he came along, as Dave Chappelle points out, and says, everybody in the house is cheating and stealing from you, and I'm just going to tell you what's going on in there. It was all there. It was just he had the nerve to out it, to say this is what's going on. And it's the same thing with you and your book. My wife is a huge fan of what you've had to say in this. A lot of it resonates with her at a personal level. And she's the one who kept saying to me, you need to get Megan on the show. You need to get her on there and to discuss this. And by the way, I had every intention of doing that. It's just that I've been in and out of the country so much, and my focus has been elsewhere. But every now and then I pick up my Twitter and I go, okay, so what's going on here? Who's shouting at who? And what Megan is apparently starting a fight over here with this. But the reality is that these people were already waging war with soft words. I'm reminded of the psalmist who said, their words were as smooth as butter, but their hearts were war. Is that a fair characterization of these people, the way they work?
Yes, and it, to me, there's also the proverb, and this is the one that has stuck out in my mind as they're circling wagons to defend some of the things that Keller and others said, it's that proverb about telling your starting a fight with your neighbor and then saying, but I was only joking. So
Yes,
what we've had is all of this commentary and then going, but that's not what they meant. Well, it's pretty clear in black and white what was said, and the record is clear. And part of what has been surprising to me is trying to distance from things like Keller's close association with someone like Michael Ware, which, if you're not familiar, he was a former Obama staffer who became a well-known architect of evangelicals for Biden. And when you see people like that, and you see Keller and others who are perfectly comfortable to promote and recommend Michael Ware and not people on the political right, I don't understand how you can deny what's happening. That yes, these figures have been politicizing the church, and they've been doing it in a progressive direction. So it surprised me that there's even a denial. But as far as the bomb throwing, I feel like I didn't really throw a bomb. I feel like all I did was recognize these are the problems that have been going on in this very troubled marriage within evangelicalism for a long time. And that's what it feels like to me, is that it's been a marriage where everybody in the room can feel that there are all these significant, massive issues that we're not talking about. And I feel like they're not going to get resolved until we finally acknowledge, hey, here's what's going on. And we've gone for so long now that it's like we haven't been having honest conversations. And bringing these things out and doing that quoting, doing that direct, here, let me lay it out for you. Let me lay out for you the record, has made people so uncomfortable. But I don't really see any other way that we get to a point of unity if we don't start actually talking about what the issues are.
Megan, what has moved you to do this book in the first place?
At the end of the book, I gave my testimony, and I'd never done that before. And it was very vulnerable, very uncomfortable. I had kind of alluded to it a little bit in speaking and writing over the years, but I had never done it in a really specific way. And part of the reason I did it here was because there has been such a cottage industry of books, from that guy you haven't heard of, Tim Alberta, from Kristen Dumais, from many others.
Maybe that's just a statement as to how out of touch I am
that's good.
with some on the left, but I'd never heard of him.
But there's been, and he had a big best-selling book, and all of them kind of coming from the left, critiquing the church for supposedly being politicized, for selling their souls to the political right. It's become a serious cottage industry. And I presume you do know Kristen Dumais and her book, Jesus and John Wayne, and many, 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 many other titles like that. And so I wanted to be clear that that's not what I'm here to do. I'm not here to deconstruct the church or degrade the church, because as somebody who had a serious prodigal past, who I was raised in a Christian home, I went away to college, I did that that very much proverbial eating with the swine for a number of years and found myself miserable, drug addicted, abusing alcohol, all of the attendant fallout that comes along with that. I was just absolutely miserable. It's a long story and you can read it in the book, but because of an English literature class and an encounter with the Quest for the Holy Grail, the Vulgate cycle version, not the Thomas Mallory version, I found myself identifying with Lancelot and became a Christian.
La Mort d'Arthur, the death of
Yes.
Arthur.
See, I'm never confident enough to say it, so I'll let you say it. But if you know that version, you know that there's all these hermits who come out and confront Lancelot. It's not this star-crossed romance between him and Guinevere. It's hermits confronting him about his sin and his base living. And so when I happened to read this for a class, I was really convicted, particularly in the lifestyle that I was living. I became a Christian. And then I got involved a little bit in Christian therapy, you might call it, where I was still struggling with sin and I was going to these counseling sessions and being encouraged to look at the trauma in my past and what had been done to me and try to figure out why I was still presenting these self-destructive patterns. And around that time, a pastor at the church gave me John MacArthur's The Vanishing Conscience and said, I think you need to read this book. And it was just completely alien to everything I was learning about how to deal with my sin. And I know this is shocking. It said, stop sinning. Just stop it. And, he laid out a prescription, a biblical prescription for how to stop sinning, how to embrace sanctification, how to embrace your identity in Christ, and to recognize that you are a new creation who can now be empowered through Christ to stop doing that. And so these things just completely transformed my life. And so I so completely cherish that teaching that transformed me, that gave me the tools I needed to stop sinning, to lift myself out of a life of degradation, to meet my husband, to form a family, to become a contributing member of society. And so I want that for other people. I want to protect the church for that. I want to protect these ministries and these institutions for the next Megan who walks through the door. And so that, I think, is such a huge reason and why I was so passionate about writing this book, because I see the damage that turning the church into a social club will do to these people who really need the words of life. And they're not going to get that if they're walking into the church doors and hearing about how they need to become climate change activists.
Drilling down into that just a little bit, we believe, I think I speak for you in this regard, just reading you and listening to you, but correct me if you think I'm mistaken here. We believe that as Christians, we should engage in the political realm, but that it is our Christian belief that informs our political views, not our political views, our Christian belief. What would you say to someone who's listening right now, and maybe they're very conservative, politically speaking, but they've never had that dramatic encounter that you're talking about with Jesus Christ? I mean, it was Jesus Christ that changed your life, right? Not Donald Trump.
Absolutely. That was one of the things I wanted to dispel about this book is, I talk about Donald Trump a little bit because when you're talking about how the church has taken up the issue of politics, you can't avoid him. He is the elephant in the room. But it was more about the Christians who chose to support Donald Trump because of issues like the sanctity of human life, because of their commitment to protecting children from gender insanity. I think he is just emblematic of why they're doing what they're doing. It's their convictions that are coming from Scripture that are driving them to make these choices. And I also think, by the way, that's why you see our culture working so hard to disparage them, why they're working so hard to disparage the evangelicals who are motivated by protecting life in the womb, by protecting children from being mutilated and told that a man can become a woman, and disordering their psychology and their minds into believing something that's not true and rejecting God's created order. So it's because we believe in Jesus Christ that we care about these issues. But the first order of business always is to preach Christ and Him crucified. And in no way am I or I hope anyone else, suggesting that as we're having these in-house debates, that that's something we're putting by the wayside. Because to me, if that is the first order of business, if we're raising him on high, then people are going to be attracted, and we don't have to try to package the message into any particular. We actually don't even have to worry about how is our political support of Donald Trump going to impact our witness. That to me is a totally disordered priority. I'm not even sure why we're having that conversation, because if you're just doing scripturally what we're commanded to do, which is be salt and light and speak out into these various issues, that's going to sort itself out. So I don't worry about stuff like that.
Do you, obviously, when they said, what were the words you said they used, that you're broken and
wounded and unwell.
Wounded and unwell. When they say that, obviously what they're doing is they're weaponizing the testimonial part of your book.
Right. And I do, by the way, I realized after I said that, I want to mention, I think that's what it was coming from, is that they had read the book and I had given this testimony at the end, and I have to assume that's what they're drawing it from.
Yeah, of course. They've decided to go to that and go, aha, so here she is with this sordid past, and we're going to weaponize that against you. Has that been hurtful for you? Because, as you said, you've chosen to be vulnerable. And I would suggest to you, Megan, before you answer, that testimonial has been far more helpful to people than maybe the vocal minority that you hear from, that you may mistake them for being the majority of people who are reading the book. But has that been hurtful?
I mean, a little bit. I was probably angry when I saw that, but I have a funny husband, and he so immediately was like, that's hilarious, that I think it's a bit of a wall of protection for me, that, he's like,
Good.
Come on, honey, that's how desperately they're trying to discredit you right now. And by the way, it also showed the willingness to be really nasty, right?
Yeah, of course. And this is the way they operate, is they use soft tones. It reminds me of, the way they work reminds me of a scene from Saving Private Ryan. Have you ever seen that?
Years ago.
Well, there's this awful scene where a German soldier is killing an American, and he's slowly plunging a knife into his heart, and he's whispering to him very softly as he's doing it. That's the way the left operates. A final question for you, Megan. I say final. You may say something here that makes me want to ask you another one. But on this particular show and throughout my career, I have tried very hard to listen to the left, quite literally, so that I tried to get to know the New Atheists, for instance, when they were coming along with their spate of best-selling books in the 2006, 2007, 2008, on the heels of 9/11. I thought, before I start writing on these guys, I want to get to know Hitchens and Dawkins and Dennett and all these guys. I want to hear what they have to say, and then ultimately debate them on these things. So I want my Christian faith to be an unafraid faith. Now, I say that while at the same time, as we said earlier, knowing my lane. You can do as much damage as good for the Christian faith by pronouncing authoritatively on things that you possess no expertise in. But I did want to get to know them, and I found that they were willing to engage. I've been in Dawkins' home a few times and argue with him to this day. Sometimes I'll write an article or something that he may take issues with, and he'll fire off an email to me and tell me that. And of course, the late Christopher Hitchens was a good friend of mine, and I debated Dennett on Al Jazeera and so forth. But I have found these guys, they don't want to debate. They don't really want to debate. And I don't even mean just in a formal sense. With Vischer, he kept going on. He kept DMing me recently on Twitter. And he was giving me the impression he was game for either a debate with you. And you probably saw my tweet where I said, I haven't talked to Megan about this, but listen, I'll provide the forum where she's going to be on the show soon. So be easy to bring you in. And if you want to go at it with me, I'm happy to do that. We just need to clarify what the topic is going to be. But I'll be happy to do that. And he would just keep going at the issue, DMing me about it, rather than actually ever committing himself to a face-to-face discussion, which I find to be the most helpful. And again, it would give him the opportunity to clarify his viewpoints and to challenge my own, which he says, have no merit. And I said, well, then I should be easy pickings for you. You should want to do this so you can expose the fraudulent nature of my arguments. But I sense you don't actually have any views, and I sense you really don't want to debate, that you're afraid to do that. Did you at any point in going, and writing about some of these individuals, I get it, that Keller, had already passed away, but did you ever have an opportunity to have an honest to goodness sit down with a Russell Moore or with a David French or with a Phil or any of these other people that were mentioned to actually go back and forth with them on their views?
No, and I will tell you that's not for lack of trying. So, I started doing some of this work that was just reporting at that point, before it turned into a book, long before Keller passed away.
For Daily Wire.
That's right, for the Daily Wire. And I reached out to him and got no response. I reached out to Russell Moore on any number of topics multiple times, David French, N.T. Wright, Rick Warren, Andy Stanley. And the same thing is a few of them I have gotten some private back and forth with, but nobody who wants to publicly talk about any of these issues. And in fact, I have run into Russell Moore before in an airport and said, we were on the same flight. And I just said,
I remember that.
Well, I said I had tried several times to get an interview with him. At that point, his assistant was still saying, well, he's got COVID or he's traveling or he has a conference and can't do it right now. And it was after a series of these sort of brush-offs where we just happened to be standing next to each other in the airport. And
I'm sure he loved that.
I know. I said, oh, Dr. Moore, Megan Basham. And, I don't think he knew who I was at first. And I just, can we talk about some of this right now? We're just standing here. We've got 20 minutes. We're boarding this plane. We're awkwardly standing next to each other. Can I ask you a few questions? And he said, no, you need to schedule that through my assistant. And I kind of chuckled, hopefully very winsomely, and said, oh, come now. We're both standing right here. We've got nothing else to do for the next 20 minutes. And he said, no. You would have to schedule something like that formally through my assistant. So even in, just casual chat, no, I was never able to get them to talk about anything. And I think part of that is because they want to control the forum. So if you're firing back with these vague allusions, for example, Russell Moore just came out with this essay in Christianity Today about slander and decrying slander. And a lot of people, and I don't know if this is true, but a lot of people think that this is a reply to me. But it doesn't mention me, and it doesn't mention any of the things I bring up in my book, because at that point, you have to discuss specifics. At that point, you have to say, here are the ideas and the issues we're talking about. Here are the policies you've endorsed. Here's the people you're involved with. And they don't want to do that. So instead, it's this very general tone policing to bring this full circle of, well, you shouldn't slander. Well, of course you shouldn't slander. But if what you're saying is true, then it's not slander. And we can't know that until we start to talk about specifics. And I think that's why they work so hard to avoid doing that.
I think it's very interesting because, listen, you don't know anyone to debate. I don't know anyone to debate. And they don't know anyone to debate. On the other hand, if I'm going to sit back and write, a critique of this book, maybe numerous, pot shots on social media, and you offer okay, well, let's have a discussion about the book, and then I wave off. I never really want to do that. And just to be clear to the audience, I did contact you and said, listen, Vischer here seems like he's open to an actual discussion with you. He said on Twitter, he implied that you've been avoiding him. So you replied, said, yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And you also said on Twitter, what did you say? Unequivocally.
Yes.
I think that was your word.
Unequivocally.
I'm in. I would be willing to do that. He then wouldn't do it. So I think it's very interesting because these are individuals who I feel less hostility towards those who are outside of the church. For instance, going back to the New Atheists, They never pretended to know the Bible. They never pretended to take it seriously. They never pretended to be one of us. But in 3 John, it says there are those who they went out from us. They went out from us. They were not a part of us. And that's what we're talking about. These are figures like Diotrephes in 3 John. They're insidious elements within the church who are not really part of the church in my view. And therefore, they deserve a stronger measure of denunciation. It's interesting because I had an interesting conversation with Lori recently about this because she didn't like, when she listens to this, she'll correct me. So I want to be really clear in what I'm saying here. It wasn't that she didn't like what I was saying about Tucker Carlson platforming a Nazi apologist. But she said, boy, it sure makes me nervous. Sometimes the fights that you pick. And I said, Lori, she said, why not make it about Kamala Harris rather than about him? I said, Lori, it's very interesting. The New Testament, Jesus spent more time going after not the Romans, but those people, the false teachers within. And by the way, I'm not calling Tucker Carlson a false teacher. Russell Moore is a false teacher. I think Carlson was just very naive in hosting this individual. But I think it's so very important that for people on our side, and by that I mean Christians, evangelical Christians, that in the case of personal sin, that's a private matter. That is a private matter to be dealt with privately that does not involve me, if it's you, or you if it's me. Public teaching is a different thing. It's a very different thing. And so I'm sure you've had people say to you, Megan, why did you reach out to them privately? And it sounds like you did. But I go to Galatians chapter 2, where the Apostle Paul says he confronted Peter to his face for what amounted to false teaching. And that's because it was a public matter and had to be dealt with publicly. And in the case of figures like this, the potential to lead so many people straight off of a theological cliff is so huge that the biblical model is to confront publicly when it comes to false teaching. And by that, I don't mean, Megan, you got a footnote wrong in your book, or, hey, you misspelled unequivocally. But where we're talking about a matter that regards salvation, that pertains to major issues, that has to be confronted publicly. And that's what you've done in this book, and I applaud you for doing it. It took courage to do it. I'm sure the book was very difficult for you to write. I'm sure that you got loads of pushback that you're not even mentioning here. I certainly have seen the tempest in a teapot on Twitter, and I do hope that you'll bear that in mind, because it's easy to think that's the real world, and it just isn't the real world. And I think you've got huge support from individuals like my wife, who she has written a review of your book, but she's not on whatever the Google platform is or whatever where you have to post it. But she said, I wrote it for myself. She felt very strongly, positively about your book. I think you have a lot of people who feel very supportive of what you've had to say and are eager for people to push back at this kind of nonsense because they sense it. And so that brings up the next question, final question. Is there anybody you wish you'd have included in your book?
Wish that I had included or had not?
Yeah, is there anything or anyone that if you had to do this all over again that you would have included in this book?
Oh, yeah. Larry, there's so much. I don't know that I want to do a sequel, but we could easily do a series. There was so much that ended up on the cutting room floor, but I'll tell you one big one that I didn't fit in that I really regret, that if I'd had more time, I would have, was simply women's ministries, groups like IF The Gathering. So much of what I think has been unbiblical, that has been emotionally manipulative and played on naivety and played on misplaced empathies, has come through women's ministries and well-known women's teachers, people like Ann Voskamp, and others like that. I look at what they're doing, and I think that could be its whole own separate book. So if I could do it again, I would have had a whole chapter on what some of these big, well-known women's ministries are doing, and also Christian academia. I sprinkle Christian academia in throughout it. It was going to be such a big topic that I kind of felt like, I don't know that I have the time or space to open up this entire other issue that should be its own book. But I can tell you, and you know this, that the Christian schools, the campuses, the colleges are deeply, deeply compromised. And in so many ways, they're indistinguishable from secular academia. And I think we have a huge problem
Worse.
there. Yeah.
Worse, actually.
Yes, because they're doing it under the guise of sound doctrine when it's not. And so they're bringing in all of this stuff, and man, some of the seminaries. So those are big issues that I would have written about. And hopefully we'll do some further reporting, but it needs attention.
Well, Megan, I said it was a final question. I do have one more. One more. I have a theory that a lot of this is sociological. And what I mean by that is this. I mean, ideology obviously factors into it, but sometimes I wonder if some of these people, on social media, with the Atlantic or the New York Times, progressives at Christianity Today, if part of this isn't being driven by the fact that they're embarrassed by red staters, let's say, or evangelicals, and they want to show themselves to be very socially acceptable. And sometimes I sense among some of my friends at places like the New York Times and elsewhere that really what they don't want the association. They see red staters, they see the middle class and down as just a hairy unwashed they want nothing to do with. Excuse me. And I see part of my own mission is to be a defender of just normal people, just regular, common people. But a lot of these people are just very elitist. Did you bump into that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a good description for what I felt like I was doing here. I had heard from so many ordinary people in the pews who felt that they were being bashed around by some evangelical leadership, and they feel confused and they don't understand how they have become the scapegoats for so much of what's supposedly going wrong in America when they're reading their Bibles. They're trying to be involved in their local churches and do what's right. So it has been disturbing to me to watch them get kicked so much. And I think that was a huge part of what's motivated me is, I've been angry. I've been angry to watch the kicking and wanted to say something about it.
Well, and you've done a good job at it. Megan, it's been great to have you. Thank you so much for your time. Where can people get your book?
Well, you can get it anywhere you can get books. HarperCollins website if you want an independent bookseller, Amazon, Target, Barnes & Noble, really anywhere. So, and please do get it. I appreciate it.
Do you do the Audible version yourself?
I do.
Or does someone
I read
else
the
do it?
Audible, and we've sold a lot of those. I really enjoyed doing the Audible, recording it. So gotten a lot of really good feedback. And so I will say that is my preferred method, actually, of consuming this content. So I recommend the Audible.
Fantastic. Well, Megan Basham, thank you so much for your time. I hope people will go out and buy your book immediately. Thank you for your integrity, for your hard work, and for being willing to take the arrows in publishing a book like this.
Well, thank you so much, Larry, and thanks for having me.
This has been Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.